dictating to us how we live our lives. He covered a whole host of things in all the letters. And we've been dealing with one in Bible study, the letter to the Philippian church. But this covers the whole of Paul's life and not just the Philippian church. So this morning, I want us to look at Paul, the chosen apostle. And there are two readings, Galatians 1:15 and Philippians 3:1-7. Just to put the whole thing into perspective. Now, some of you might be sitting here and saying, what I'm hearing now is what we heard the other day in Bible study. Well, if you are hearing now what you heard the other day in Bible study, two things. One, you're awake now and you're awake then. Okay, so that's good if you recognize the fact that we've done this once already. Some of it. Just, some of it, because this reading comes out of Philippians. There's a picture of Paul, the apostle. Not a picture, a drawing or something, because Polaroids weren't invented yet when Paul was running around. What's wrong with that picture? Anything wrong with it? Because when I picked it off the internet during the course of the week to do this PowerPoint, I said, I wonder if you'll pick what's wrong with that picture.
Alex knows.
Alex knows, I keep guessing.
No.
He's got a halo?
That's what I said.
But I mean, St. Paul should have a halo, that's all right. Yeah. Alex knows, but she's the pastor's wife. They didn't have any books those days. And he's reading out of the concordance there, it looks like. And that's not quite right. So when I looked at that picture, I thought, let me stick it in. It looks like Paul. I mean, doesn't it? I don't think so. I don't think he looked like that. He was a short little Jewish guy. I don't think he looked anything like that. But he's reading a book, and I thought, let me put that in and see how awake we are this morning. He should have been reading a scroll backwards, or whichever way he read it. So we're going to read those two readings this morning together. But when God, who set me apart from my mother's womb and called me by his grace, was pleased. That's Galatians 1:15. And then Philippians 3:1-7 says, Further, my brothers and sisters, rejoice in the Lord. It is no trouble for me to write the same things to you again, and it is a safeguard for you. Watch out for those dogs, those evildoers, those mutilators of the flesh. For it is we who are the circumcision, we who serve God by his Spirit, who boast in Christ Jesus, and who put no confidence in the flesh, though I myself have reasons for such confidence. If someone else thinks they have reasons to put confidence in the flesh, I have more. He wasn't arrogant at all, this guy. All right? And then he says, circumcised on the 8th day, of the people of Israel, of the tribe of Benjamin, a Hebrew of Hebrews, in regard to the law, a Pharisee, as for zeal, persecuting the church, as for righteousness based on the law, faultless. Okay. But whatever were gains to me now, I now consider loss for the sake of Christ. So he's just giving us a little story about who he is. That's all. We had a great time, by the way. It was 3 Bible studies, that little bit that I read. We had a great time with that because there's so much you can sort of take out of it. But I'm not going to preach for that long this morning, just to got to sort of cover over it because we're going to cover a lot of his life as well. It was the worst storm the sailors had experienced. The sails were ripped by the winds. It left the ship without steerage. The cargo was cast overboard. I'm sure you're all thinking of Jonah at that time, eh? No, you're not. The giant waves threatened to swamp the ship. Neither the sun nor the stars appeared for 14 days. All hope of being saved was lost. Suddenly, in the storm's darkness, a shadowy figure cried out, Sirs, be of good cheer. There shall no man's life be lost. Who is this man? Look, he is a felon. He is in bonds. He's tied up. What is his name? His name is Paul. In these same waters, some 2,000 years later, a man of high rank in government and commerce said to a missionary friend, "The Apostle Paul is one of the few men of the ancient world who was absolutely modern. He changed the course of history." The historian Lecky says civilization came to Europe in a ship with a man named Paul. So they place a lot of emphasis on this man called Paul, or named Paul. Historians do. Not just biblical historians, historians. And there he's writing on scrolls. You see, he's not writing in a book or in a journal or something like that. So let's look this morning then and try and understand a little bit about Paul's background. Let's look at his ancestry. If I had to stand here this morning and say, let's look at my ancestry, it's quite scary. Okay, I mean, you know, you've got to shake a cupboard and you see the skeletons start falling out. You sort of try and keep them closed. You know, you take the cupboard and you close it. You say, don't let that secret out. Do you know that? Leave it. Okay, now we want to know a little bit about Paul. Where does he come from? The Christian religion was cradled in Judaism, naturally. Because the first part of our Bible, the Old Testament, is very much their Bible. Behind it lay the amazing history of the Hebrew nation. Into it went the idealism, the faith, the divine revelation, and the providential guidance of the patriarchs and the fathers. 4,000 years of influence were here. That's a lot of influence. Though Paul was born of the Jewish faith, Christianity was to leave its ancestral home and be spread around the world. It wasn't just going to stay in one place. The seed sown in Judean soil was to become a tree whose leaves were the healing of all nations. Jesus, the divine founder, had given this command: go into all the world and preach the gospel to every creature. How many of you have preached to a sheep? Thought I'd just ask because I have. And it's amazing. I was a little ackie. Sorry, lighty means little ack, just in case you don't understand local colloquialism. And my dad had a butcher shop, so therefore he had sheep. And these sheep were still very much alive, by the way. They weren't hanging in the butcher shop, you know. And I went out there and I started preaching to the sheep what I'd learned in Sunday school the Sunday before. You know what happens when you start talking to sheep? They all come and they come closer to you and they face you. And there's almost an understanding when you're talking to them. Much like this. So I was taking literally, go and preach the gospel to every creature. I don't know how many of those sheep were saved because they all made good chops at some stage. Okay. But Christianity was in danger of becoming another Jewish sect, like the Essenes, the Zealots, or the Pharisees. There was this huge problem that it could have. Then God chose a man named Saul of Tarsus. Who was he? What was he like? I suppose we ought to let Paul tell his own story. And he speaks of it in Philippians 3:3-7, which I've read, and 1 Corinthians 15:8-10. He calls himself an apostle. The source of a stream is not where it rises in some green glen among the hills to make a tiny sparkling bit of water, but in the mighty sea that is drawn upward by evaporation to form the clouds. Then these cast down their droplets upon the mountains, and the drops come together to form the stream. So it is with life. Paul felt that he had been foreknown and predestined by God. And I'm not going down that road this morning on predestination and foreknowledge, okay? I'm just saying he felt that he had been foreknown and predestined. So he says to the Ephesians, he chose us in him before the foundation of the world, in Ephesians 1 verse 4. In youth, we suppose that our life plan is of our own choosing. We are the masters of our own destiny. Isn't it nice to be young and think that? And we all did it, I'm sure, at some stage. Thought that we're masters of our own destiny. I mean, I planned out my whole life. But, God changes things. In a sense, this is true. For God will not violate the human will. Yet, in his infinite knowledge, he knows what influences will move us. He knows what gets us to change if we want change, if he wants us to change. And as we review our lives, we discover that we choose because we are chosen. We love because God loved us. We leave the tomb of our selfishness because God says, come forth. We are delivered from the sacraments of death because God has already provided the living seed. How does a man's life come to be? And the Apostle Paul says, by the grace of God, I am what I am. Interesting. God said to Jeremiah the prophet, before I formed you in the belly, I knew you. And before you came out of the womb, I sanctified you. I ordained you a prophet to the nations. Before you were born, God has a plan. So Paul discovered the hand of God in his life. To the Galatians he said, it was the good pleasure of God who separated me even from my birth and called me through his grace to reveal his Son in me, that I might preach him among the Gentiles. Who were the Gentiles? The non-Jewish races. Okay? And they were like dogs to the Jew, or to the Hebrew, whichever way you want to say. See it, or whatever you said. Paul would not have said this in his youth, but now he sees it, you see. In his youth, he was narrow-minded. He could look through a keyhole with both eyes at the same time. So narrow. You know people like that? I'm sure you do. God has a purpose for every life. He does. He has a purpose for us. We might not know what the purpose is, but he has a purpose for us. Where we are yielded, that divine will is made known to us. So only when we actually yield or give, I'll say give in isn't the right word, but when we actually surrender or commit ourselves to Christ, then you see where he's actually working in your life. One of the interesting studies of the human life is to see how circumstances and influence shape the determining will. Every thread is needed for the completion of the pattern. Where does the pattern begin to take shape? Early in life? Yes, even before the life becomes such. Paul speaks of a prenatal grace of God. He reminds Timothy that the grace he has is a gift through his grandmother Lois and your mother Eunice. 2 Timothy 1:5. What sacred obligations parents and grandparents have? To give your children all other gifts, but the gift of grace is to beggar their soul. Not good. What shall a man profit if he gain the whole world and lose his soul? There are hundreds of thousands of parents who by precept and profession are saying to their children, it is important for you to get a good education, to have a good job, to choose a good companion for life. But if you've got a daughter, you're going to sort out every guy that comes around anyway, so you'll choose a good companion for your daughter. But God really doesn't count. How many people are actually saying that to their kids? You know, it's all about the education, the job, and wah. Why is it that our children want to get married? Well, they ain't wrong with getting married, but they, don't get me wrong, don't read that in the wrong way. They want to get married, then they want to live in a house exactly like their parents are living in, that they've worked 30 years for, to try and pay that house off and trying to get it into the condition. But the kids want to start with a house like that. I heard two of the leaders this morning talking about motor cars with air conditioners. You know, one bragged that he never had an air conditioner for the first, how many years, Bradley? 15 years. 25 years he never had an air conditioner in a car. How did you survive? No? Well, it's easy. You open the window. It's quite simple. You know, it's the same as if you're flying over to Bangkok tonight and it's hot. Warren can open the window. Okay, well, I thought I'd just mention that. She's flying. We try and impress upon our children that they need. Now, I'm not knocking. Some of you are sitting in varsity and, you know, you're trying to get good education. And there's nothing wrong with that. I did read in the news yesterday that in, I don't know how many years, 10 or 15 years' time, lawyers are going to be redundant. So those of you studying law, chuck it. Start something else. You know, do something that's more up to date, like a car that drives itself. An Uber car. You know, one of those. I'm sure they're going to come from Germany, those cars that drive themselves. And Hans isn't even here today. He's in Germany, probably looking for a car like that. But there's so many things that we take for granted in our lives. And our parents say, you need this, you've got to do it, you've got to do it. You know, I was going to say I'm a doctor, but I've got to be careful because we've got doctors here. I'm an accountant, so therefore my son must be an accountant. He hates accounting. He scraped through in matric. He hated it. But you know, I'm an accountant. You should be an accountant. And we push it onto them. Maybe he wants to be a hobo.
Oh.
Let him be a hobo. No. Okay. Oh, some parents don't like that, eh? Okay. Right, let's move on. Let's get serious here. Paul's home. Let's talk about his home. We know his ancestry now. We know where he comes from. Let's talk about his home. And I can start with the opening sentence. We know little of Paul's home. End of point. Next point. In fact, his parents are not mentioned in the Bible. History says, through the pen of Jerome, his father was a native of Geshila, however you pronounce it, in northern Galilee. Okay, Gisehela. He was driven from his home by civil disobedience at the death of Herod. Then the family escaped to Tarsus. Not Tarshish, that's where Jonah escaped to, tried to go to, Tarsus. They were rather well-to-do, so Paul was afforded a good education. They were Roman citizens. And this in itself was no empty adornment. It saved Paul at one time from a whipping and another time from crucifixion. Now, the fact that he was a Roman citizen was a plus. And as a Roman citizen, Paul had a right to appeal to the emperor. As a Roman citizen, he had that right. We are told in Acts 23 that Paul had a sister, Paulette. Okay. Now, we don't know what her name was. But the sister's son warned Paul of a plot to kill him. His sister's son told him about it. So we do know that little bit. In his defense at Jerusalem, Paul said that he was a Jew of Tarsus, a city of Cilicia, citizen of no mean city. This was true, for Tarsus was the capital of the province. A city of at least 500,000 people, Tarsus was the crossroads of two continents. So, you know, they're always important places. Here met the highways of the east and the west. Behind the city of Tarsus, the mountains stretched as an endless barrier to separate the two worlds. Although moving from Asia to Europe came through the Cilician Gate, not Sicilian, I'm getting mixed up with Italy, the Cilician Gate, through Tarsus went the balsam of Jericho, the spices of Arabia, the sword of Damascus, and also the gospel. How's that? Here in Tarsus, in a Jewish home, in a Roman province, in a Greek land, Paul was born. I love that. Here in Tarsus, in a Jewish home, in a Roman province, in a Greek land, Paul was born. Paul's name means ask for. I think his name speaks a bit of the piety of his home. Though this family was away from the land of promise, yet Paul's parents were faithful to the religion of their fathers. So Paul says in the Philippian letter, I was circumcised on the 8th day of the stock of Israel, of the tribe of Benjamin, and a Hebrew of the Hebrews. The last is a remarkable expression indeed. It really means that he was sprung up from the Hebrews. The phrase speaks of more than just nationality. It means to grow up among. It means all that a person is influenced by. It would be the same as saying the following. He is typically South African. He's born a South African. Sorry, you Zimbabweans, Malawians, and everyone else. Reared in South Africa. Educated in South Africa. Influenced by South Africans. All South Africans. That's Paul. He wasn't born in South Africa, but that's where it was. And he is proud of his Hebrew ancestry. In 2 Corinthians 11:22 he says, are they Hebrews? So am I. Are they Israelites? So am I. Are they the seed of Abraham? So am I. It never occurred to Paul to apologize for his race, not even among the cultured Greeks or the critical Romans. Paul's Jewish ancestry was always a cause of thanksgiving to him. He could say, in Christ there is no east or west. Yet he loved his Jewish ancestry. It is strange indeed that God would take this zealot, this Hebrew, this seed of Abraham, this Benjamite, and through him lift Christianity from its Judean cradle and cause the love of God to embrace people of every race and nation. We follow the course of the gospel's triumphant journey across the empire as we trace the footsteps of the empire's first missionary. We will find blood and agony in the pathway. Paul will be beaten, stoned, and shipwrecked. But at the sunset end of the journey, he will say, I have fought the good fight. I have finished my course. I have kept the faith. Henceforth there is laid up for me a crown of righteousness. I know when we come to church, we're supposed to be preaching Christ. Well, I am. I'm preaching about the guy who spread Christ to our forefathers, who in turn spread it to us, to where we are today. It's through his influence and his work and his sacrifice that the gospel spread throughout the area, the known world at the time. So we can all have thoughts about Paul. Some people don't like him. Some people don't like him at all. And I said on Thursday in Bible study that at college, and then we weren't in a big college. I didn't study in a huge college. It was a small college, about 12, 14 of us, or around about there. And all the guys said, when the day that they die, they want to meet Paul. They want to find out from him why he wrote these things that are so difficult for us to understand. And then somebody else was wise enough to say, well, you better get used to standing in queues because everybody wants to ask you that. We're not going to ask David or Goliath or any of those people about what we want to know. We want to ask Paul because he had the influence on us. So I truly trust that as the weeks go, we get into the scriptures of Paul and we look a little bit more in depth in what he was saying and why he was saying it, that it'll unfold in our lives as we push ahead with the gospel. Let's learn a little bit about somebody that wrote most of it that we read anyway. Let's pray together.